Hello, everyone. This is Professor Wyman with another mini concept video for Psych 144. In this video, I'm going to focus on type 1 and type 2 errors, and that is related to significance testing, which in this class, we're focusing just on null hypothesis testing. So in our null hypothesis testing and significance testing, the idea, as a quick review, is that we're trying to learn about the population. So in this example, we have a population of adorable baby turtles, and we want to learn about the population. But let's say that we wanted to learn about the population of turtles in Fresno. That would be pretty much impossible to do. There's a lot of turtles. We'd have to track all of them down and learn whatever we were trying to learn about them. It's just not feasible to do that. And it could be that it's actually impossible to collect that information. So, if we're trying to get data from every single person in the United States, that's just not going to happen. There's too many people that are hard to reach. And then you have to factor in expense. There's lots of reasons why we can't get population data. So instead, what we do is we take a sample. So we take a sample that is a small part of that population, and we calculate information about that sample. So we calculate statistics. And the sample statistics, we can use that information through inferential testing. We can make an inference and we can say, we think we know this about the population based on our sample. We think that we found this information. So null hypothesis testing is the specific type of significance testing that we're focusing on for this class. And what our steps are here is that first, we assume the null hypothesis is true, which is that there's no relationship in the population, or that relationship is not real in the population. So we assume that that is true. That's our first step. Then we calculate the probability of getting that sample statistic as or more extreme than what we got, which is our p-value. We calculate that using our different types of null hypothesis tests. And then we need to compare that to our significance level, or alpha. So as the researcher, we set this alpha level. In psychology, it's typically 0.05. Now here's where error comes into it. Remember that we're making a decision based on evidence, but we don't have proof that this is true. We're basing our decision on probability. So we are working with probabilities that we're basically making assumptions with based on how sampling distributions work. And so one of our decisions is that if our p-value is really low, if it's less than 0.05, we say that we're going to reject the null hypothesis because it's really unlikely that we would get that sample statistic if the null hypothesis is true. So this is our first option. Our other decision is that we could fail to reject the null hypothesis, and that is when our p-value is greater than or equal to our alpha, which in this case is 0.05. So this is a decision that we make as a researcher. What we need to keep in mind is that there is this unknown truth about our population, and we don't usually know it. So with error, we need to acknowledge that unknown reality, and we need to talk about the possibility that we're wrong, that we're making the wrong decision. Here you can see I have a table that explains the difference, and the Kahoot activity gives you some examples of this. I will also go through some examples after this. We have our decision. So here's our decision, researcher decision right here. And we have two options. Again, we either reject the null hypothesis or we fail to reject the null hypothesis. And then we have the reality, which is what we're trying to learn about, but it's typically an unknown population parameter. It's something that we don't know. And again, there's two options. It's either that the null hypothesis is true in the population, which means that we shouldn't reject it. So we should not reject something that's true, or it's that it's false. And that's where we should reject it. So we have these things that we should be doing, and we need to compare it to our actual decision. Now, if we have a situation where we reject the null hypothesis, what we're saying is that the null hypothesis is false. So here, if I reject the null hypothesis, but is in fact true in the population, what's happening is that I'm encountering this type 1 error. A type 1 error is a false positive. It's the idea that you found something, you found a significant difference, but you're wrong. And you're not going to know. That's the fun part. So we're making these estimates based on information, based on the best information that we can get, hopefully, that it's conducted well. And you're saying that we think this is what's happening, but you have to acknowledge that there's a reality that we might be wrong about. So a type 1 error is actually equal to alpha. So if we talk about alpha being 0.05, we're basically saying that we're accepting 5% error, that there's a 5% chance that we're wrong. Now, this is where we've talked about that medical research might have a smaller alpha, or often has a smaller alpha because they're not willing to accept as much error. There are a lot of people who are advocating for psychologists to use a smaller alpha. But again, this idea is that we might be making the wrong decision. So if you are rejecting the null hypothesis, and you shouldn't reject it because the null hypothesis is in fact true in reality, then that's a type 1 error. The other option is that you make a correct decision. So here in this right here, this matches. So we have this null hypothesis is false. We should reject it. And so if we reject it, and we should reject it, that's not an error. That's making a correct decision. Now, by contrast, if we fail to reject the null hypothesis, and we should fail to reject it because it's true, this is our correct decision. So these match. We're looking at fail to reject the null hypothesis and should not reject that the null hypothesis is true. The error that you can run into if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, but you shouldn't, is a type 2 error. So this is a false negative. This is where you didn't find anything, but you missed it, that the null hypothesis is in fact false, and so you should have rejected it. So the key to understanding the error that applies to your study and what we'll be working on in lecture is that you make a decision, and you just need to acknowledge reasons for reasons that could explain what you found, but also identify what the possible incorrect or what the possible reality might be that you didn't select. So I'm going to show you some examples, and then there are more examples in the Kahoot. So example 1, our alternative hypothesis is that anxiety is related to depression. Our null hypothesis is that anxiety is not related to depression. So in the population, anxiety is not related to depression. This is our statement about reality. A researcher determines the relationship they found was due to sampling error. So you want to break this down and identify, okay, what's the reality and what's the decision, and do they match? So here, we're saying that in the population, anxiety is not related to depression, which means we're saying that the null hypothesis is actually true in the population. Now, this is obviously false. I'm just using this as an example, or at least it's false based on what most research tells us, that anxiety is related to depression, right? So a researcher determines that the relationship they found was due to sampling error. So here, we have a researcher determines the relationship they found was due to sampling error. You'd want to look at that and say, okay, well, what does it mean to determine that it was due to sampling error? If it's sampling error, then we're saying that there is no significant relationship, that the null hypothesis should not be rejected. So we just happen to get a sample this extreme. So this matches. This is actually not an error. This represents a correct decision. And again, this is hypothetical. We don't usually get to know what is true in the population. So again, this is not an error. For example 2, there is a difference in empathy by gender is our alternative hypothesis. And then our null hypothesis is that there is not a difference in empathy by gender. So our example here, there's a difference in empathy by gender. The p-value is 0.09. Again, you need to identify what is the reality and what is the researcher decision. You'll have your own technique for identifying this, but we can see that we're saying there is a relationship. So this is our reality. There is a relationship. And if there is a relationship, that means that our null hypothesis should be false. We should reject it. Our p-value is 0.09, which if I don't give you a p-value, we're going to, if I don't give you an alpha level, we're going to assume 0.05. So here we're going to fail to reject the null hypothesis. But we just said that there's a difference in empathy by gender, so we should reject it. So we're making the wrong decision. That is a type 2 error. That is a false negative. We are going to fail to reject in this situation, but we missed it. The last example that says example 1 on it is that jealousy is related to age. That's our alternative hypothesis. And then our null hypothesis is that jealousy is not related to age. So if a researcher determines that the relationship they found was significant, and in reality there is no relationship, again, we need to look at what's reality, what's our decision. Our reality is what I like to start with, is that there's no relationship. So we should not reject the null hypothesis because it is true. And then a researcher determines the relationship they found was significant. When it's significant, that means that we're rejecting the null hypothesis, but we just said that in reality there's no relationship, so we shouldn't reject it. So this is a type 1 error. And this again occurs when we have a false positive where we found something, but we found something that isn't there. So what you'll need to do is look at your study results and identify what type of error you could have made. And then just talk about in your discussion section why that could have happened. If you did find an error, what does that mean? So it could be that the method in which you collected your data was not the best way to do it. So maybe you used a questionnaire that didn't do a great job at measuring what you were trying to measure. Could be sample size, sampling error. We have sampling error is just a fact of life, right? So you'll just need to discuss these and identify potential types of error.